Good afternoon, and thank you so much to the Brennan Center and the Campaign for Liberty for both today's event and also for ensuring a space for discussion and examination of community impacts of CVE approaches. If this, the earlier panel can be talked about as the theory, here the goal is to talk about the practice and the impacts that have been had. Now, as I think most of you know, and I'm going to keep this very short because we've got a rich set of experiences on this panel that I think should be the focus, but as most of you know, here in the United States, there are 3 pilot cities for CVE programs, Minneapolis, LA, and Boston. And we have, to my right from Minneapolis, Jelani Cobb, the executive director of the, Jelani Hussain, I can't believe I just did that, the executive director of the Minneapolis affiliate of the Council for American Islamic Relations. Next to him is Shannon Irwin from Boston. She's the co-founder of the Muslim Justice League. We also have with us today Dr. Rizwan Sabir, who's an assistant professor in criminology at Liverpool John Moore University, who will be able to talk to us both about the impacts of CVE programming as a result of Prevent in the UK, as well as his personal experiences, which are described in his bio. And you'll note that I'm not repeating details of anyone's bio to keep us going. And then finally, to the extreme right, we have Pat Eddington, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. And together we're going to be talking not just about the impacts, but also towards the end of the conversation, what might be done, what's permissible to do, what's a good way of proceeding if the panelists think there is one. I've talked briefly about the pilot cities, but it's also important to know that there is a strong cities network that has recently been launched, and there's a close intersection between what's happening here in the United States and the efforts that the US is taking abroad. The Strong Cities Network is one aspect of CVE programming, and at least the cities of New York, Minneapolis, Atlanta, and Denver are involved in what is described as a partnership to share evidence-based strategies and build resilience and social cohesion. But I think one aspect of what has been confusing, difficult about CVE is what is it? And the earlier panel talked about that. And so I'm going to ask Jelani to start by talking about how CVE programming has played out in Minneapolis. What has your experience been?
First of all, I'd like to just thank Brennan Center for putting this together. Obviously, CVE has been much more of a national story, and many of you know the fact that Minnesota has been talked about a lot in the news regarding this issue, not just recently when CVE has been actually talked about specifically, but morely since 2007, 2008, predominantly because of young people leaving to Somalia to join, at the time, a terrorist organization called Al-Shabaab, which still exists. And so Minnesota has had somewhat of a history in regards to this issue. And so therefore, the community there have been, in the past and until now, at the table with the Department of Homeland Security discussing this issue as it continues to exist. 2014, when CVE, this pilot project, was announced, there was no real known discussion about CVE's pilot program. There was a lot of meetings about a lot of different issues, but specifically there was no, we're going to have a pilot program, where is your community input? Rather, we started to hear that there is a pilot program, and there is going to be, and there is a community input already. And so it started off, unfortunately, in a very uninformed process. And so I'll keep my comments to about pretty much two things. One, what does the community think about this program specifically, and what has been the experience in Minnesota? First of all, in January, there was several discussions about the CVE program. One that we hosted with David, who you heard a little bit earlier, and also Mike German, just to talk about this program and all the implications regarding the theories as well as the actual programs. And so in our meetings with actually the U.S. Attorney's Office, who was leading this project, immediately when we started to talk about previous programs and addressing the narrative of CVE, we met immediate hostility, that we were against the program, and in fact, we have not even known what the program is about. We were just trying to inquire to find out what actually the program was about. So there was actually a meeting in January 30th that we had civil rights organizations sitting in front or meeting with the U.S. Attorney as he showed us about 10 or 11 PowerPoint slides about the program. And obviously, we provided some recommendations. One of them was, the title. We talked about specifically the title. How do we arrive there? And also the other programs that were being addressed. Many of them already part of the framework that has existed for a while that actually came out of Department of Homeland Security roundtables, which we're going to get more police officers who are from the Somali community and such. And immediately in that meeting, we got tremendous pushback. And since then, we've almost, majority of the community has lost the ability to know what's been actually coming, what's the actual program.
So what do you actually know about it? And is there who's involved in it? So
eventually when those meetings happened, then the U.S. Attorney formed his own task force, a 15-member task force that is inclusive of the Somali community. This task force is now the group that is speaking on behalf of this program. They did several things that initially we were discussing. Number one, we talked about the program itself, and then also previous programs that the Brennan Center actually reviewed documents in Minnesota where there was actually effort to address this issue. But those programs that were supposed to be social services actually turned out to be part of a surveillance, or had directives of actually surveillance as part of the program, which actually the community organizations who were part of it had no knowledge of. And so we were talking about all of this, and then we heard of a 15-member task force. Some of the members went to the White House, and then others were later added on. And then the community, we actually had a lot of internal discussions with the majority of the Muslim leaders, trying to educate them, trying to let them understand what all of the what this issue is, even ourselves as we were trying to grapple with it. And so the program itself, it involves social services, it involves after-school programs, et cetera. And so we initially said, these programs are needed in our community, but we want to know what the correlation is between preventing or stopping radicalization and these actual programs. And so we obviously never got any response from any of our specific questioning of the program. But there was, I would like to say, before May 1st and after May 1st. So before May 1st, there was a lot of internal discussion within the community about the program. People wanted to know more. A lot of answers weren't coming. The U.S. Attorney's Office was meeting with some people. He would give them some PowerPoint presentation and request those PowerPoint presentations to be handed back after the meeting. And so there was a lot of confusion. And so they had a lot of meetings, specifically one to call on the leadership, the Somali imams met, and they were majority in disagreement of the program and the way it was starting to shape. But they decided not to make it publicly known. And then so there was two things that followed each other that changed the dynamic of the CVE program. First, there was an op-ed by three members of the task force that were part of the U.S. Attorney's Office. That was followed a few days later with arrest of the 6 young men who are now facing charges. And then after that, obviously, the majority of the Muslim community came forward and said, we need to be heard. Because the op-ed actually specifically said the Muslim leaders support CVE, which was not the case. And so on May 1st, we actually published a list of 50 organizations in Minnesota, majority of them, which represent the majority of the Muslim population, and many other organizations who opted out not to sign a statement out of the, just they told us we don't support the program, but we're not ready to sign a statement like that. And when that statement became public, actually, reporters started calling all of these organizations saying, did they actually sign this statement? And so after May 1st, there has been a complete silence or lack of actual discussion about the program, other than those 15 people. So the U.S. Attorney's Office went from meeting majority of the leadership in the community to discuss about many issues, not just CVE, but also specifically other issues that the community had questions about. And so from May 1st till now, there has been almost no meetings between the majority of the leadership and the U.S. Attorney's Office, while this program has actually developed. And so I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about what happened during the Al-Shabaab recruiting and how did that kind of led to where we are today. So in 2007, 2008, and 2009, there was a lot of young men who left to join the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab. And so that story became very publicly, and immediately what started to happen was the actual surveillance of mosques. So I know others, Dave mentioned a little bit about that and others, but the reality was there were actually black SUVs outside of a mosque for 24 hours, which created a tremendous level of paranoia. Following that, over the surveillance, what actually took place and actually hurt the community's ability to address these issues, which also David talked about a little bit earlier, is the fact that community felt that they had no longer a space to discuss issues that are actually happening abroad, out of the fear that if they come to a public forum and they make statements that they would then be followed by the FBI and others. And so specifically, there was actually one case where one of the young kids who were recently arrested, the family members informed me that they requested one of the imams to go visit him in jail just to provide some spiritual guidance. And the imam refused, and he said, if I go there, I will be followed for the rest of my life. So post-Al-Shabaab recruiting, there was a level of fear, and so then what happened was two things. One, there was this unwritten law or unwritten code that no longer, Muslim institutions were no longer would have an actual open dialogue or events to discuss some of these issues. Secondly, many parents, out of the fear that something was happening in mosque, actually removed their children from Sunday schools. And so the community became actually much more fearful and much more suspect of things. And so when CVE was actually announced, people were getting pieces of information. And actually, my office was being called, and mosques were actually asking me about a CPR class that their local city was offering, if that had anything to do with CVE or a CRT program. So there's a lot of confusion and fear, and we tried to communicate a lot of that to the U.S. Attorney's Office, but much of it was really dismissed. So just to kind of where are we right now in Minnesota? The program seems to be moving forward. There was an announcement that was made on September 10th, a day before September 11th, that the program and the funding, which majority were coming from local community foundations. And so it seems like the program is moving forward, but the community still is at a position now where they are opposing. And so few things that have actually come out that we heard about in the prevent program, which we did not, hopefully, we hope that we wouldn't get to that stage at this level. Obviously, the divisiveness is there. There is those who support the program and those who are against the program. Predominantly, the majority of the community is against the program, and many people easily have created their own scenarios of what CVE is and assume that anyone who gets money or anyone who's doing anything about CVE is literally an agent of the law enforcement. And finally, also, we are starting to see that even religious ideologies being addressed. So in one of the cases of the young man who was recently arrested, members of the Sufi community said, well, we're Sufis, and therefore, we are less likely to be, part of that ideology. And so division, obviously, a great deal of confusion, and also the fact of clear opposition. But we believe the main reason why actually there's some support for the community is the direction that the Minnesota program has focused on, which is to provide social services, to provide after-school programs, to provide these. And we've been trying to say that we need these programs to address many of the issues that actually do exist, but we fear that these programs, this is not the way you should be working toward our community. Rather, let's talk about these programs being available for the community without the fear or without narrowing it down that this social service program is actually going to address countering violent extremism. So in Minnesota, two things happened. They changed the name, Community Resilience, which is now I hear that it's becoming the new name for other places as well, and also to focusing completely on social services and providing money at the table. And actually the U.S. Attorney's Office in a debate, or not a debate, but question answer that him and I had, he referenced several times that it's does your community not want money to address issues? So we're not even talking about the actual issue, we're just talking about funds coming to the community.
Jelani, in 1 minute, I'm going to ask you a question, and if you can,
yes
in just 1 minute. So when at the White House summit, the program in Minneapolis was discussed, it was discussed as including a component with social services, mental health providers, public schools, to identify youth who were at risk. Mm-hmm. And one of the responses that was made was, what are the safeguards that you are going to put in place, the walls between intelligence, law enforcement, and the ethical obligations of mental health providers, for example, the privacy issues that might arise, the social services issues that might arise. Did the community ever get a response back on those kinds of questions?
So the statement that we made, actually, the statement that the majority of the community organizations signed on to had those specific, not both only recommendations, but also questions about safeguards. We have had actually absolutely no real communication with the U.S. Attorney's Office about this program. All of the questions we've asked have actually not been responded to. We've had discussions with the Minneapolis Public School, which publicly said in their program, their CVE program, and this is actually available on C-SPAN if you would like, they said that their program is to actually monitor Somali kids during lunch hour and after school for signs of disfranchisement, which could include mood swings or anything, or religiosity. We don't know. We don't know exactly. We have not heard publicly that they have actually denounced this program, but we know there are others who have shared interest about it. So.
Okay. Thank you. Shannon, do you want to talk about the experience in Boston?
Sure. Thank you, Hina, and thank you as well to the Brennan Center for having me here today. The Muslim Justice League is really appreciative of all the information that you've already provided our communities across the country on this issue. In Boston, we've had a similar experience in some ways to Minneapolis, certainly in terms of the lack of transparency about how this program specifically is operating, and in terms of the community divisiveness as well. In Boston, Lisa Monaco, National Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama, announced back in April 2014 that Boston would be a site of a DHS local envoy on countering violent extremism. And that's when we first learned that we were basically in the headlights of the federal government in terms of this program. It wasn't until that fall that community members started to receive, a few select community members chosen by the U.S. Attorney's Office of Massachusetts, letters inviting them to participate in working groups. Community members were invited to one working group, which was described as a working group on civic engagement. I believe it was community leadership and civic engagement. We later learned there was a separate working group convened of law enforcement folks, which was titled a working group on threat assessment. And both of these groups met a couple of times and then had one joint meeting and produced a framework on countering violent extremism, which actually has already, by that point, there had been pushback from the Muslim Justice League and other organizations about the very premises of CVE, and so you can see already in the framing of that framework, it's not called Countering Violent Extremism, it's called a Framework for Prevention and Intervention Strategies Incorporating Violent Extremism into Violent Prevention Efforts, which is certainly a mouthful to submit a Freedom of Information request about. But the framework starts out by reiterating, acknowledging to the credit of the U.S. Attorney's Office a strong objection to the very premise of CVE, which is, it notes researchers across the globe have made it clear that the path to violent extremism is not linear and there are no valid or reliable indicators to predict who is more likely to engage in violent extremism. Nevertheless, it then goes on to include dozens of possible things that community organizations and law enforcement can do. It's been described by our U.S. Attorney's Office as a menu of options that folks can implement to address a number of problems that they lay out. The first problem, though, they describe as some young people may be at greater risk of feeling isolated and alienated, making them more vulnerable to recruitment by violent extremism or extremists. So we see this strong tension between an acknowledgement that there is no evidence for a CVE approach, but then nevertheless needing to produce something to address a problem, taking a CVE approach. And since the release of this framework, and prior to that time as well, we have had numerous conversations with our U.S. Attorney's Office where we have sought information about precisely what are they viewing as indicators or, in their terminology, vulnerabilities to violent extremism. What are they sharing with communities about what to be on the lookout for? What would an intervention look like? Because this framework contains a number of proposed trainings for folks to learn about how to intervene if someone is potentially going to, in future, mobilize to violent extremism. In response to our questions, they have continued fairly consistently to say that they don't know yet. This is a community-driven project. They understand there are no indicators, and that's what makes this so difficult. So there are a number of aspects of this framework which would be incredibly positive if they were not under an umbrella of counterterrorism. Things like investing in English language learning resources, or culturally sensitive and appropriate mental health services, right? Things that all of our communities need, all disenfranchised communities need. But the problem is very similar to what Jaylani described in Minneapolis. These are being provided to communities because they are seen as potentially at risk of being violent, and that in and of itself is very stigmatizing. We don't know whether any funding has been issued to any organizations under this program yet. I will say one next step that was identified in the framework that's particularly concerning to the Muslim Justice League talks about enhanced communication among law enforcement, mental health, and social services agencies. In coordination with others, who aren't defined, existing methods of communications among law enforcement, local, state, and federal, mental health, and social services agencies will be assessed so that methods can be enhanced. That's incredibly vague language, but it does to us raise concerns about observance of confidentiality standards and safeguarding of patients' private information and clients' and students' privacy as well. So we haven't been able to learn specifically what the vulnerabilities that are being shared are, what the manners of intervention that are being encouraged are. We do know that our Executive Office of Health and Human Services is a part of the Greater Boston Regional Collaborative on CVE. And it was interesting that actually the Attorney General, when she spoke recently at a UN general meeting in New York, cited the pilot cities as sort of successes and reasons for extension to, of this approach to the Strong Cities Network, and even referenced that the Executive Office of Health and Human Services was sharing its expertise about violence prevention. But when we subsequently asked our own U.S. Attorney of Massachusetts what exactly that meant, she reiterated that nothing has been worked out yet. There are no vulnerabilities. There are no intervention strategies. And so that's an interesting tension, again, that the pilots are being cited as successes and reasons for extension of this approach, yet we can't get information about how exactly the pilots are operating. In terms of the community impacts, I'm not a researcher. I don't have broad empirical evidence. I only have anecdotes. But what I can say for sure is that I am not aware of folks in our local Greater Boston Muslim communities who have identified potential recruitments to armed groups as their most pressing concern, or even a pressing concern prior to when this initiative was announced. At that point, there were incentives to try to fit folks' pre-existing priorities, very important priorities like addressing domestic violence or school bullying or lack of language access in social services within this framework. And because the framework is so sprawling, there do seem to be many opportunities to do that. So there are incentives for underfunded agencies to potentially see if there is some way that they can obtain funds without harming the community. And I think there are some groups that are wondering right now whether it's worth trying to do that. At the Muslim Justice League, we have deep concerns about the very premises of the program, and based on the experience in the UK that you'll hear more about, think that that's a dangerous path to go down. But we've heard a couple other reasons that folks have considered participating in CVE, which I think are interesting to share or informative to share. One, I'll share an anecdote of a gentleman who is a father, is very critical and aware of U.S. policies towards Muslims, including overbroad prosecutions. And he's a father, that's relevant because he's a father of a teenage son. And he mentioned that he feels like CVE might be the only way to protect youth like his son from prosecution, from federal prosecution, such as what occurred to Tariq Mahana. If folks aren't familiar with the Tariq Mahana case, Tariq Mahana was a young pharmacist in Massachusetts who was very outspoken about U.S. foreign policy. He was interviewed by the FBI a number of times and evidently made some false statements, but he was prosecuted not only for those false statements, but also under the material support statute, was prosecuted for translating a document, 39 Ways to Jihad, which had been many times translated from Arabic to English and other languages. The theory of prosecution was that he was providing material support to al-Qaeda, which is actually a departure even from the Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project case in its extremeness. And so this case really sent a message to our local communities that there is, in case we weren't certain until that point, there is apparently a Muslim exception to the First Amendment. And I think that many parents have felt terrified to let their teenagers go on social media, not because they believe that their teenagers are necessarily going to do anything wrong, but because of the scrutiny they may be subjected to. There's a belief that the Constitution, yes, in theory, applies to us, but in practice we see that it's not offering our youth protection. And so it was very troubling to me to hear this father say, to say that he felt that this was actually a way perhaps to protect his son, a real fear-based response to our law enforcement agency. The other brief note I'll mention in terms of a community response, some folks have said they wonder if this could help protect us from Islamophobia. It will demonstrate that Muslims are doing something about this problem of extremism. I think that maybe the experience in the UK is informative to that concern as well. And I will just close by saying, in spite of these examples of reasons why people have shared they're considering participating in CVE, overwhelmingly the response has been oppositional. People have rejected the idea of being treated as a suspect community, and there's a very powerful dissent actually at the end of the framework itself from the executive director of our largest mosque in New England, and I will leave it at that.
One quick question for both of you. The government, federal level, and in the pilot cities has been at pains to say that these are not programs aimed as such at Muslim communities. Are you, at your sort of municipal level or state level, aware of similar efforts and outreach to other communities through the CVE lens?
No.
No. I'll just add, I think that in Minnesota, it's gone even beyond just the Muslim title. This is a Somali issue So it's been targeting toward the Somali community, while actually many of the kids who have actually left were not Somali, and those who are even being charged were actually not Somali either.
Okay. Rizwan, we'd appreciate your reflections based on the experience in the United Kingdom with PREVENT, both with respect to what you've heard about what's happening in the cities today and where things are going with PREVENT, or anything else you want to share now in the UK.
Okay, I'd like to start by just thanking the Brennan Center for inviting me. I thought I wasn't actually going to make this event after spending 2.5 hours with the Department for Homeland Security yesterday, who asked me actually what I was planning on speaking about, and then made a note of absolutely everything that I hoped to be saying. One of the questions was, are you planning on helping the US government, and how are you going to do so? So I answered him as honestly as I possibly could and said, I hope to inform the US government and anybody else who's listening that if you want to deal with the issue of political violence, then please, for the love of Christ, do not copy the United Kingdom. And the point is obviously me trying to be funny, I should say, but it's a more serious point, and that is that the policies that the United Kingdom has introduced in order to deal with this issue, what is known as extremism in quotation marks, has been operational in the United Kingdom a lot before it was kind of given the name PREVENT. My own personal experiences in 2008 were prompted by a university administrator and the university management at the University of Nottingham, referring and reporting myself and a colleague of mine to the police after finding a copy of the Al-Qaeda training manual. The document was, of course, available from bookshops, but I downloaded it from the US Department of Justice website, because that's where all the terrorists go to get their documents. So the point was that this kind of approach of disrupting so-called Al-Qaeda sleeper cells or networks and individuals has been operational a lot longer than we often think. What the UK example shows is that now you kind of implement a policy and then it evolves and it develops. And now if you imagine a policy in 2006 when it was implemented, largely being about community engagement, generating the trust of the community and building partnerships, if you fast forward to 2015 today, it's now a legal duty on nurses, teachers, university lecturers, college teachers and opticians and so on and so forth to essentially spot the signs of what a future terrorist looks like and to refer and report that matter based on extremely loose and ill-defined, often racialized indicators that are now being justified in the name of, oh, well, we're not only targeting Muslims, but we're also dealing with the far right. Well, actually, academic research that has been done, for example, Dr. Katie Sayan, an academic at the University of York in the UK, her research in one example showed that two schools on the same road, one with a very large Muslim constituency and one with a not so very large Muslim constituency, the Muslim school, or the one with the Muslim students, was subjected to PREVENT, whereas the one across the road wasn't. So there's clearly this racialized logic, but then you've got to understand this framework through a politicized lens. And the politicized lens is, there was a point made earlier by one of the speakers that we need to kind of break away from seeing this issue as being connected to an international front. On the contrary, I would say that actually the CVE strategy or the PREVENT strategy in the UK is connected to this narrative that the opponent that we face here at home and abroad is actually the same opponent, and that viewing individuals and communities as being either responsible for reinforcing the grievances of those individuals abroad or speaking up for causes abroad is more than a reason to actually target these policies at home. So what we find in the UK example is that ideas and viewpoints which don't even call for violence are claimed to be supporting the causes and the grievance espoused by people at home but also abroad. And that only leads to kind of this closing down of discussion and debate. Now some people, and I'll finish on this point so you don't have to send me a note, but some people say to me that, you must support the PREVENT program now, or CVE as you're calling it, because it means people won't be subjected to unlawful arrest and so on and so forth. Well, no, actually, I still don't support the PREVENT program for the simple reason that when you're subjected to force, when you're subjected to questioning, whether it's by DHS or stop and search on the streets of London or Birmingham, you know that you're being subjected to an action by the state. Coercion is obvious and overt for everybody to see. But the problem with the PREVENT program and what will inevitably happen with CVE is that it will close down a discussion and a debate, and it will stop individuals from airing views. It will cause them to self-discipline their behavior and self-censor their viewpoints. So from an advocacy and a community perspective, it becomes extremely difficult to empirically prove and measure that actually these policies are having an extremely draconian and problematic impact on the community. So individuals will turn around in policy circles and neoconservative think tanks and say, actually, the evidence is that the Muslim community don't have a problem because they're quietly accepting everything that's happening. Yes, they may well be accepting, but the only reason is because they're absolutely frightened to come out and speak and to resist because they're afraid that actually if we do speak out, then we may be subjected to force. Now, Shannon, you mentioned a really interesting point which I actually want to finish on, because there was a recent case in the United Kingdom. An individual was subjected to mentoring under the Channel program on 3 separate occasions. He's 15 years old.
Explain the Channel program.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay. So when an individual is detected as being a radical, they are put forward for de-radicalization or mentoring, right? I use all these words in quotation marks. But that individual was subjected to de-radicalization programs on 3 separate occasions. On those 3 separate occasions, the different authorities and agencies involved in de-radicalizing him failed. That individual now, who is 15 years old, has only a matter of months ago been given a life sentence under the terrorism legislation for inciting terrorism in Australia on Anzac Day. So he was trying to persuade somebody to use a knife in order to execute a police officer in Australia on Anzac Day. Now that individual has been given a life sentence and is in prison. Well, what it shows, and this is your point, that people think that if we engage with the PREVENT program that we will be safe. But actually what this case does, it gives us a very clear example that if you don't play according to the rules of the game as set by authority and those in power, then there is a very high chance that you may well find yourself back to the hard-edged spectrum of law enforcement and prosecution and the judiciary.
All right. Pat, the government, let's just step back a little bit after having heard the sort of on-the-ground perspectives, but here in the United States and elsewhere, the governments have emphasized a real need to focus on the prevention of tragedy and prevention of wrongdoing. We've talked about this preventive model. We talked about it a little bit earlier today. And on one level, that's really understandable, right? We all want to prevent tragedy and wrongdoing. And Jelani, you talked about how people in impact communities in Minneapolis themselves want to prevent kids from traveling abroad to do things. And we've also talked and heard about the program's focus on Muslim communities. I'd like you to talk, if you can, about whether you think there is a way that these programs can be structured to avoid focusing on Muslims, and what the pros and cons would be of focusing on violent extremism more generally.
Well, I want to thank you and my dear friends at the Brennan Center and the Campaign for Liberty for inviting me here today to speak on these issues. And as someone who has personally been the subject of government surveillance and investigation, for those of you who've been on the receiving end of that, believe me, I feel your pain. Do I believe that there's anything salvageable about what is by definition an illegitimate program? No. And to quote someone who is much cleverer than I am, we have seen this movie before. And while, yes, it is true that I am thinking about Tom Cruise and Minority Report, and that's how I kind of view this program generally, very quickly, in about 60 seconds, I think. I'm going to time
You have time.
I'm going to time myself on this, see if I can pull this off. We have seen this phenomenon before, right? And Rizwan kind of set me up very nicely here for what I'm about to say. For the last 100 years, 100 years, if you have been a member of a group who is perceived by the federal government to be part of either a national or an international movement or activity that is viewed as a threat by the federal government, it is not a question of whether you will become the subject of surveillance and harassment. It is only a question of how much of it you will get. It started with anarchist and socialist and anti-war activists in the early 1900s. And then, of course, it became even worse as we got into World War I with the passage of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act and some of these other things. And we actually had, at that point in time, a functioning socialist party in this country that was then systematically targeted for destruction by the federal government, because you had members like Victor Berger, Congressman Victor Berger of Wisconsin's 5th District, who were outspoken in their opposition to U.S. involvement in World War I, and they charged him under the Espionage Act for that. And he wound up serving at least part of one of his terms from prison. This continued, of course, in the post-Bolshevik era, the post-Russian Revolution era, with the initial Red Scare, the Palmer raids, things of that nature. And then it mutated, of course, into that additional Red Scare that happened later. But in the middle of that, of course, we had World War II. And what happened there? We had an entire group of loyal Americans, Japanese Americans, who were systematically rounded up and put into, for lack of a better phrase, a kinder and gentler series of concentration camps in this country. We had a second Red Scare, quote unquote. And in this period of time, it wasn't just the executive branch that was engaged in this. It was the Congress of the United States that was aiding and abetting it through things like the Overman Committee at the end of World War I, and the Dyes Committee during the 1930s and early 1940s, which mutated into the House Un-American Activities Committee. We actually had a committee of the Congress of the United States with the title House Un-American Activities Committee. It existed for over 30 years, right? And my fear today is that we're seeing that kind of mutation essentially with the House Homeland Security Committee. And I'm happy to get into more detail on that as we go forward, but I bring that committee up because it's the chairman of that committee, Mike McCall of Texas, who has offered a bill, H.R. 2899, which would institutionalize this entire CVE insanity, right? So this is part and parcel of kind of the larger problem we have here. This is ultimately a political problem, and it is being fed and aided and abetted both by folks in the executive branch and the legislature. And I think it's imperative that we note that there was no CVE program proposed or instituted after 2 white Christian males with prior military service blew up 169 of their fellow citizens in Oklahoma City in April of 1995. There was no Patriot Act passed after that incident. Okay? The creation of CVE and these CVE offices is the antithesis of the mentality that gave us the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, and the creation of the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Justice. When they created the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Justice, it was about taking a group of people and uplifting them out of the oppression, including the murder that they had been subjected to for over 100 years. And here we're talking about the creation of entities within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the Department of State, and elsewhere that will have exactly the opposite effect. And I will give you People's Exhibit A, and then I think I can actually shut up at 5 minutes. This is People's Exhibit A as far as I'm concerned. I copied this or printed this off from the Department of Homeland Security website. It's entitled Countering Violent Extremism, Training Guidance and Best Practices. The first sentence, in recent years, the United States has seen a number of individuals in the U.S. become involved in violent extremist activities. If they just stopped there, they would have been better off. They went on to say, with particular activity by American residents and citizens inspired by Al-Qaeda and its ideology. Okay, maybe a true statement, but they don't talk about the KKK. They don't talk about the sovereign citizen movement. They don't talk about individuals like Dylan Rood, who murdered those 9 people in Charleston earlier this year. No mention of that in here. Now, here's the irony. Point 2, training should be sensitive to constitutional values. Well, thank God they're going to be sensitive about it. It should state training shall adhere to constitutional values and the rule of law. But point B, training should focus on behavior, not appearance or membership in particular ethnic or religious communities. That is exactly the opposite of what these programs are doing. And that's my warning, essentially, to my many friends in the Arab American and Muslim American communities. If you think for a single minute that going along with these programs is going to exclude you from being prosecuted using the material support provision of the Patriot Act or anything else that's been passed post 9/11, or for that matter, go back to the Espionage Act, you are engaged in a form of magical thinking, and I say that with all due respect. The federal government is engaged right now in an extremely dangerous and irresponsible activity with this entire program and approach. And if they get away with doing it to one group, in the same way that they got away with doing it to socialists, to labor union activists, to African Americans, they get away with doing it to you, they'll get away with doing it to anybody. And when that happens, we are no longer living in the Republic of the United States of America.
So, Pat, thank you. But I'm going to press back on all of us, because why not? And say, what should the government be doing? What should communities be doing? So if anything, and you all may decide nothing, but I'd like to press that point, because that is a question that gets asked. And what should the relationship be between government and communities when we're talking about violent extremism? You could decide not to accept that frame, but I still want to pose this question.
No, and I appreciate your point. I think, again, I go back to this issue of, if you allow the federal government to create a program like this, which has not existed for any other group before, it is literally enshrining a form of discrimination against Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. It is a dangerous and irresponsible pathway to go down. There are any number of things that can and should be done to deal with this kind of problem here domestically. And my friend Mike German, who worked at the FBI for many years, as many of you know, he can talk to that in, I think, a great deal of detail. But I'll just give you a couple. I think it has to start with law enforcement not being the lead on something like this. It has to start at the community level. And if the federal government is going to have any role at all, and I'm deeply skeptical, and it's not simply because I work for a libertarian think tank, I'm deeply skeptical about any kind of federal role here in this respect. Because I think any time that you begin to take federal dollars, you begin to allow yourself to potentially be coerced into going along with things that you otherwise might not do. But I think here, if we start having a more community-focused dialogue, and this is where I think local elected officials need to be the ones who take the lead. It should not be law enforcement, right? So local electeds at your city councils, your mayors, your folks who've actually been elected by the people, they should be the lead, essentially, in dealing with this. Folks that have experience in dealing with troubled youth, where troubled youth actually happen to be a problem. We have a huge number of folks in this country who are extremely experienced social service workers dealing with issues of troubled youth, whether it's gangs or anything else. That, to me, is where you start if you're going to talk about the local level. With respect to the federal government, there is no doubt in my mind that federal policies have helped to create at least part of this problem, and they've certainly helped to aid and abet the terrorist problem. There was no al-Qaeda in Iraq until we invaded it. There was no ISIS in Libya until we overthrew Muammar Gaddafi with the help of our European partners. So when our foreign policy is such that we go around and we create chaos in the Arab and Muslim world and create vacuums where these extremists can then set up camp and begin to engage in the kind of atrocities, as well as the social media and propaganda campaign they engage in, we have no one to blame but ourselves for that. So to me, to begin to address that part of the problem, you begin to dial it back from an international standpoint. You go to a demilitarized approach to dealing with this particular problem. You know, we defeated, the Western allies defeated a major terrorism problem in Europe in the 1970s and 80s that was very politically motivated, the Red Brigades, Baader-Meinhof gang, et cetera. And it was done using law enforcement and targeted, and I use that word advisedly, targeted intelligence practices. And that's precisely how we're going to deal with this problem, I think, particularly in an overseas context. But we need to demilitarize what we're doing, both at home and abroad. That's my overarching message.
Rizwan, your thoughts on what the government should do, what communities should do, if anything, and the role between the two?
Yeah, sure. What should the government be doing is creating more open spaces for discussion and debate. I mean, it seems like an obvious thing. We actually need more radicalism, not less. And the reason for that is because terrorism, being the radical fringe of the radical kind of mindset, you could say, if that's not too problematic, is when people feel isolated and kind of disenchanted in the middle ground, they usually draw to extreme ends and feel like that because the change that they so desire can't be brought about through the existing political system, which actually in advanced democratic nations like the UK and even America is capable and resilient enough to accommodate that change, they feel compelled to shock the system externally, and they believe, as previous speakers have talked about, in the supremacy of violence, because they live in extremely violent societies, whether it's nations declaring war or whether it's structural violence constantly being displayed and articulated towards them. So the way you deal with this issue is you create more space in the middle and you accommodate legitimate requests for political change and social change. Now, a lot of that requires political will, and that ultimately comes down to politicians accepting that if they genuinely want to make us safe from individuals either traveling abroad to engage in armed action, or whether it's people here in the US or the UK wanting to engage in armed violence at home, then the way you do that is you create that space, you don't close it down. The second thing I would say is that you need to engage with the voices that disagree with you. You can't create organizations or only speak with organizations who either echo what you say or agree with everything you say, because all that serves to do is reinforce what you're already doing. And that becomes quite dangerous because it legitimizes your own thoughts and actions, and it becomes ultimately an echo chamber. So I would say engaging with voices that we don't agree with, you can only find agreement when you find someone who you disagree with. So that's an extremely important step. And I would say the final is a more general kind of point, that you can kind of say that we will allow communities and we will give resources and money to communities in order to carry out social economic programs in their local areas. That's wonderful. But we actually need to be doing that separate from the security agenda, because actually what we find is that this whole flawed scientific, or I should say unscientific claim that ideology and ideas lead through to violence, actually ideology only becomes attractive in those conditions when there is a conducive political environment, i.e., when there is a real sense of political, social, economic inequality and injustice, does an alternative way of looking at the system become attractive, and acting on that basis become feasible. So I would say in order to deal with this issue and the relationship that should exist between government and policymakers and politicians is that we need to ensure that those structural issues which do perpetuate discrimination and unfairness are dealt with more appropriately, separate from the counterterrorism and security agenda.
Shannon, same questions for you.
I would echo Rizwan's point about the decoupling of investment in social services from a securitized agenda. I think that our government can and should invest across all demographics in a more equal society, but I don't think that that should be carried out by law enforcement agencies, and I don't think it should be expected to produce any results in terms of reduced recruitment by armed groups. I would have a couple of other recommendations that are a little bit more on point to what the government seems to see the problem as, if we're defining it as, armed conflict or armed recruitment to armed groups abroad. And it's really just picking up and reiterating a point that a number of folks have said, including on the previous panel, which is that we need to take state violence into account. It's very interesting that when we criticize CVE, we are often, as Muslims, asked, well, what's your solution, by proponents of CVE? And yet, it seems that there is actually an intention of CVE to prevent Muslims from proposing their solutions on a whole number of government policy topics. So it's a little bit ironic. It seems that our input is welcome so long as we premise that input on a belief that our communities are a part of the problem, that Muslim communities themselves are the problem. But when we instead talk about bigger issues like the role of state violence, torture, and impunity, and the role that our government plays in propping up regimes that perpetrate atrocities against their own populations and neighboring populations, we are seen as diverting the conversation, talking about something tangential. And yet that seems to be far more relevant, in my view, to the question of how to address violence than talking about why some youth are so influenced by Twitter. So my recommendation there would be that the government should model the behavior that it wants to see in terms of addressing conflict nonviolently whenever possible. And I think that we should move away from pathologizing ideology and political views, and that the more that we can really have a free space for everybody to air views, no matter how abhorrent or hateful, the safer a society we're going to have. Those would be my recommendations. Could I follow up with one for the community? I'm sorry, because I know you asked that as well. I think as Muslim communities, we need to reject the internalization of our suspect community status. I think a lot of us have felt under pressure for a long time to apologize for other Muslims' actions, to provide national security solutions when we're no better positioned to do that than any other community. And I think we need to internalize our status as full citizens instead.
Shalani?
I'll just add a few more points. First of all, the government should just listen to the community. I know that sounds really simple, but they should just listen to the actual community instead of telling the community what they think should work. If you go to actually our CARE Minnesota website, you will find more information. There's a document that we released on May 1st that actually provided some recommendations. First of all, I think most importantly is to recognize, at least in Minnesota, the actual effort that the community has done to address this issue. And I give the example of the al-Shabaab recruiting, which if the government actually listened to the Somali community, we wouldn't have al-Shabaab, because the community in Minnesota were saying, do not do this foreign policy action that would result in chaos, which created al-Shabaab. But post al-Shabaab, the community came together and actually did a lot of activities. And I give an example of one incident where there was young medical students that were killed in a bombing, and the entire community responded. There were probably 10 events that took place, none of them knowing of each other. And so the community feels this in a way, and they are responding in the best way they could do. So to actually recognize there's been some positive effort, that we have no recruits to al-Shabaab, that is truly something that the community has stood forward for. In our recommendations, we talk about a Good Samaritan laws to protect those individuals who actually want to work with individuals in our community who have maybe these ideas. And I go back to the earlier statement or the earlier story that I was sharing with you, which was, an imam who fears that if he goes and visits this kid, he's automatically going to be followed. And that's the fact of the matter. If, for example, someone comes to me and I'm advising them or trying to persuade them, and I buy them coffee, and then eventually they get on a flight, then I'm going to be pretty much put in somewhere where none of you will see me for a long period of time. And so giving the community the ability to feel comfortable that they can actually address these issues, because someone comes to me today and says that, I might be shying away to respond out of the fact that that person is an informant or agent provocateur, or actually it's someone who's seeking advice and seeking help. The other point that I wanted just to also focus on is the fact that in Minnesota, since the CVE was announced, and through these discussions, we've actually created an opportunity that has not existed previously, where community organizations have actually coming together in a collaborative way, talking about best management practices, what are we doing, as a community. And so who's missing from that table? Who should be supporting that as we recommended? The government. And so the government is not even acknowledging the fact of efforts that are actually taking place. And there's tremendous great ideas that have actually produced from this. And I remember as members of different community members were talking about their suggested ideas or what they're doing, that you could see the aha in others is, I think I could do that in my center to help address the youth issues. And then finally, I think one important thing is, and I think this is the part that the community has always been available for, is information sharing. And CVE is technically not new in Minnesota. We've been talking about these discussions. I mean, it morphed to completely something different, but that the community is at the table and law enforcement should be sharing information. And that type of process should help the community be more resilient, to be able to understand what's going on so they can help their community, not knowing the fact that, that next Sunday there's going to be kids arrested or there's a new threat. But actually information sharing, which I think is a key aspect in that. So I'll let that be, but I just want to go back to the most important one, I think, is the fact that through this process of CVE, there has not been, at least in Minnesota, an actual discussion about how do we actually help this, how do we help you address this issue. Rather, we just heard of the program. Actually, in the Minnesota program, if you actually look at it very carefully, you'll find a lot of the specific items came from UK and other places.
Hannah, can I just ask one quick question?
Sure.
What do you mean by information sharing again, Jelani?
Yeah.
So I think, one of the things that we recommend is that if, for example, the FBI and others feel that there's threat or there's something going on, to be able to empower the leadership so that they can immediately address issues as they're happening. That there's been a roundtable meeting for a long period of time where they say of certain issues that are taking place in the community, and to be able to, so the community leaders and others to be empowered, whatever information is available, so that they can act upon that information.
So a top-down approach. The FBI hand the community information in order to get them to act on it.
Yeah, so if there's information out there that should be in the hands of the leadership so that they would be able to help their community, rather than all of a sudden finding out 6 months down the line that they're going to arrest a bunch of people and the community had no even knowledge of this type of activity taking place in the community. So while we're meeting, I mean, these meetings happen, but the focus should be about information sharing.
I'm sure.
Okay. Thank you, Jelani.